You know, if there's one thing you can say for sure about South Dakota's history, it's that it has always been changing. It's this incredible story of one wave after another, different people, new ideas, shaping the land. We're talking everything from ancient mammoth hunters all the way to modern-day finance. So today, let's dive in and unpack that really complex and, honestly, fascinating history.
All right, so here's how we're going to break it down. We're going to look at this story in 5 big waves. First up, the land of the first peoples. Then, the arrival of the Great Sioux. After that, we'll get into the explorers and fur traders, then the crazy rush for statehood, and we'll wrap up with how the state was forged by some pretty tough times.
Okay, so our story begins way before any lines were drawn on a map. We're talking thousands of years ago, with the very first people to call this place home. This was a land shaped by ancient hunters and eventually some really interesting agricultural societies.
I mean, check out this timeline. It really puts into perspective the sheer depth of history we're talking about here. The first hunters showed up maybe 17,000 years ago, probably chasing after giant prey like mammoths. Fast forward thousands of years, and you get the era of the mound builders, these mysterious people who left behind these incredible earthen mounds you can still see today. And then, by the 1500s, a totally new group, the Arikara, arrives from the south, and they bring a whole new way of life with them.
So, the Arikara, or the Ri as they were also known, were a real game changer. Why? Well, unlike a lot of their nomadic neighbors, these folks built permanent, fortified villages. We're talking these amazing earthen lodges. They grew crops, corn, beans, squash, and because they were set up right along the rivers, they became these incredible traders. They were like the crucial hub connecting tribes from all over. This stability they created, it made them a real center of power and commerce out on the plains.
But of course, the landscape was about to get a major shakeup. A new, incredibly powerful group was on the move, coming in from the woodlands to the east. They were being pushed west, and their arrival, well, it was going to change everything on the plains.
Now, this is absolutely key to understanding what happened next. As the Sioux people moved west from the forests of, say, Minnesota onto the wide open plains, their whole culture had to adapt. I mean, it was a complete transformation. They went from living in lodges to the iconic mobile teepee. Instead of hunting in forests, their entire world started to revolve around the bison. And maybe the biggest change of all, they mastered the horse. It became central to everything they did, turning them into the dominant power on the plains.
And it's super important to remember, they weren't moving into an empty land. Not at all. This was a massive domino effect. The Sioux were actually being pushed west by their rivals, the Ojibwe, who had gotten rifles from European traders. So, as the Sioux, the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota peoples pushed onto the plains, they in turn displaced other tribes like the Cheyenne and the Arikara. And by forming this powerful confederacy, the Oceti-Sakowin, or Seven Council Fires, they cemented themselves as the major power in the region.
All right, on to our next wave of change, and this one's a little different. It's not about a whole people migrating, it's about the expansion of empires. Europeans and then Americans started showing up, and at first, they weren't looking for land. They were after one thing: fur.
Man, this timeline really shows you just how chaotic things were. It's like the whole territory was a giant game of hot potato between European powers. So in 1743, the French show up and plant a plate, claiming it for their king. But then, not too long after, France secretly hands it over to Spain. Then Spain gives it back to France, and almost immediately, Napoleon turns around and sells the whole thing to the brand new United States, all part of the massive Louisiana Purchase. So, America's first official hello to this new territory was, of course, the Lewis and Clark expedition. As they made their way up the Missouri, it was a real mix of encounters. They had some peaceful meetings with the Yankton Sioux, but then a really tense standoff with the Lakota, who were understandably skeptical of these new guys. And really, this expedition kicked the door wide open for what came next, which was decades of fur trading. Places like Fort Pierre popped up and became these big commercial hubs. Okay, so that trickle of fur traders and explorers, it was about to become an absolute flood. This next wave, we're talking settlers, miners, railroad tycoons. This was maybe the most dramatic and conflict-filled chapter in the whole story. It was going to completely reshape the land and everyone on it.
This number right here, 98,268, it tells you so much of the story. Thanks to something called the Dakota Boom, and oh yeah, the discovery of gold in the Black Hills in 1874, people just poured into the southern half of the Dakota Territory. This created this huge imbalance.
The South was booming in agricultural, while the North was way more sparsely populated. And that split, it created a lot of political tension.
And all this talk of statehood kicked off some pretty intense local fights. I love this. It shows the battle to become the new state capital. You had towns like Huron and Pierre, basically in a public relations war, both putting out their own maps, claiming they were the true center of the new state. The folks in Pierre were even bragging that they were going to be the next Denver, just a real classic frontier town rivalry.
So, how did we end up with two Dakotas? Well, it was complicated. The South, with all its people, basically forced the issue. They just started holding their own meetings to write a constitution and separate from the North. Eventually, the U.S. Congress just said, okay, fine, we'll split it. And then you have this great story from November 2nd, 1889. President Benjamin Harrison has the statehood papers for both North and South Dakota, but before he signs them, he shuffles them all up. So to this day, nobody actually knows which one became a state first.
But we absolutely have to acknowledge the immense cost of this expansion. That gold rush in the Black Hills, it was in direct violation of a treaty with the Sioux, and it led straight to the Great Sioux War of 1876. This whole period of conflict tragically culminated in the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, which really marked the end of the major armed conflicts and led to the Sioux being confined to reservations.
Now, getting statehood wasn't the finish line, not even close. The 20th century brought a whole new set of challenges, this time economic and environmental, and they would test the state's spirit and force it to change all over again.
Just look at that number for a second. -7%. That is a staggering population decline. In the 1930s, the state got hit with a brutal 1-2 punch. First, the Great Depression, which wrecked the economy everywhere. And then, the Dust Bowl, a terrible drought that literally blew the topsoil away. This combination, it forced thousands of families to just pack up and leave, causing the state's population to drop by more than 7% in just 10 years.
So after World War II, you start to see this huge economic shift. I mean, look at the difference. Back in the 30s, pretty much the entire economy was agriculture. But the state made a conscious choice to diversify. Today, while farming is still super important, it's a much smaller piece of the pie. Tourism, especially around the Black Hills, became massive, and later, a whole new service industry popped up.
And this pattern of change just keeps going. In the mid-century, huge dam projects on the Missouri River completely changed the geography of the state. Then there was a terrible, tragic flood in Rapid City in 1972 that forced the city to basically rebuild itself. And then, get this, in 1981, a single company, Citibank, decides to move its credit card operations to Sioux Falls, and boom, an entire financial industry is born. But even with all this, the state still grapples with a modern challenge. While the cities grow, many rural areas are seeing their population shrink.
So what's the big takeaway here? It's that South Dakota has never been just one thing. Its identity has been shaped and reshaped over and over by these waves of people, of conflict, of new ideas, and economic needs. From the very first hunters on the plains to the data centers of today, the only thing that's really constant is change. Which just leaves you wondering, right? What's the next wave going to bring? Hey, if you enjoyed this summary, we've got a whole playlist of these called U.S. State Histories where you can explore more of the country's past. And of course, make sure you subscribe to Notebook Summaries so you don't miss out on our next explainer. Thanks so much for watching.